But I know as I go through this life that this earth ain't my home. I wanna go home, I wanna go home.
I'm so happy and I'm so disappointed here. I mean, happy because I'm finally wrapping up the series on suffering, but also disappointed because I'm wrapping up the series on suffering. I mean, through this study for the series, I've learned so much, more than I have for any research for an iGen video ever. And so I definitely recommend watching parts 1 through 3. All are packed with really good content answering the question, why, if God is loving, do Christians still suffer? And so this is going to be part 4 of that series, giving another reason for why we suffer here on earth. So welcome to the conclusion of Sinners in the Hands of a Loving God, part 4.
Now, this one is a little hard to teach because for those that don't really understand it is probably hard to hear. But sometimes we'll go through suffering to be more like Jesus. But before we get into the text, let me take a step back and explain exactly what that means. See, as Christians, we're called to be more like Jesus here on earth. We're called to strive to live more holy lives. And Jesus was the only perfect example of that. And so if our heart is truly committed to God, His desire for us as His children is to develop us to a stage where we're constantly striving to be more like Jesus. And I'll tell you this up front, this is not going to be a video where we just ask, what would Jesus do? No, because we're going to go much, much deeper. So, let's get into it.
Now, Jared, when you say become more like Jesus, why exactly do I need to suffer in order to do that? And when I typed that out, I just kind of stared at the screen for a few minutes because I didn't really have an answer at the time. But then I came up with an answer and kind of broke it down into 3 different things. So let's talk about the first one, starting in 1 Peter chapter 1, verse 18. For you know that it was not with perishable things such as silver or gold that you were redeemed from the empty way of life handed down to you from your ancestors, but with the precious blood of Christ, a lamb without blemish or defect. You see, this verse gives us one very clear characteristic about God. God is pure. So to be like Jesus, we must become pure. And, well, how exactly do I do that?
And the first thing that came to mind was how we prepare food. I'm talking like a really fatty food. Because in order to make it good and healthy to eat, what do? We have to chop off the fat. And it's a tough, aggressive process, but it needs to be. So think of it like this. In order for us to be more pure like Jesus, sometimes God has to chop off the fat in a metaphorical sense. And yes, it can be painful. And that's where the suffering comes in. But it's in that part of the process where God will bring us through because He loves us. And it's His desire for us to go through that process. And if our heart is fully committed to God, that should be our desire as well. Let me take another example from Scripture of how we can be more like Jesus. Matthew 19. Then people brought little children to Jesus for Him to place His hands on them and pray for them. But the disciples rebuked them. Jesus said, let the little children come to me and do not hinder them. Now imagine this. Jesus just gave a great sermon. He's probably exhausted, walks off to the side and sits down on a rock. He's just chilling there. Then all of a sudden a crowd of kids rush up to him and say, hey. Oh, sorry, that would be my reaction, but that wasn't how Jesus reacted. And the disciples tried to shoo them away, but Jesus is sitting there like, no. Let the kids come to me. See, it's not a controversial statement to say that Jesus was loving. And I love this chapter because it's such a pure kind of love that He exemplifies here, where He's probably exhausted, but when the little kids come, He doesn't turn them away. He welcomes them. And so if we want to be like Jesus, then we must love like Jesus. I mean, I just love imagining this passage, just the smile that Jesus probably had for these kids to gravitate towards Him. And if we want to express God's love, then we must know God's love. And if you watched the last video, I talked about how sometimes we go through suffering to know God. And that's where this comes in. You see, if we want to express God's love, we must know God's love. And to know God's love, we must feel God's love. And sometimes the strongest times when we will feel God's love is when we're going through a difficult time, when we're going through suffering. You see, we'll know God's love through our suffering. And only then can we truly express it.
Now, I said I had 3 things to share, so here's the third. Let me read this from Matthew chapter 4. Again, the devil took him to a very high mountain and showed him all the kingdoms of the world and their splendor. All this I will give you, he said, if you will bow down and worship me. Jesus said to him, away from me, Satan, for it is written, worship the Lord your God and serve Him only. You see, in this passage, Jesus is exhausted, struggling after fasting in the wilderness for weeks now. Satan approaches him and then tries to make him stumble. And yet Jesus still rebukes him. Ladies and gentlemen, it may be hard, but even in our weakest moments, we still must rebuke the devil. And for that to happen, we must be strong. And so, how exactly do we go stronger? Well, think about it like this. Why do people go to the gym? To work out, to break down their muscles so that the muscles, once they're broken down, can then build back to be stronger. And that's exactly the process that we go through throughout our lives. All through our lives, we're gonna be broken down, but then we're gonna be built back stronger. All through our lives, God will allow the world to break us down, but then God will come in and build us back even stronger than before. But here's one very important thing that I don't want anyone to miss. We must allow God to rebuild us.
You see, as I went back and looked at previous scripts, I noticed something. We were studying characters that all went through a difficult time, and I found that all of them had one thing in common. You see, the entire time that they were going through their hardship, the entire time that they were suffering, they still trusted in God. You see, they knew God was over it, and even though they were going through difficult times, they never doubted that. You see, their suffering never got in the way of their faith. They used their suffering to strengthen their faith. Because suffering can either draw us away from God or bring us closer to Him. And it's in that process that we learn to become more like Jesus. I mean, I only covered today how Jesus was pure, loving, and strong, but Jesus has many characteristics. I mean, Jesus was many things. And you never know what God will take you through just to teach you some of the most important lessons. Ladies and gentlemen, instead of looking at difficult times for being hopeless and dark, look for how God is moving in them. Because He always has, He always is, and He always will be. And as for this series, I'm tired. I'm taking a week off next week. Next series is going to be starting in February. And, well, for now, that's all I got. Peace out.